military intervention to provide aid during humanitarian crisis. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, a very good day to you all. We today believe that the international community has a stance to take. Myanmar has had 100,000 or more people killed for the Hurricane Nargis because of inaction by the world community in due time. North Korea has a 12.5% of its population dying due to famine since the last 6 years because of inaction. Because since 1995, there was no relief distribution in that country. We believe that the action of world community has to be taken in due time, but it was not taken in due time. It was disgraceful. And thus we believe, keeping that in mind, action has to be taken. But we also have to understand that the frequency of natural disasters are increasing each and every single day due to global warming. We've seen in the last 30 years, there has been a 31% increase in strong category cyclones throughout the world. When these sort of natural disasters are striking these countries, what stance do we take? That's what this debate is about, Mr. Speaker. And that is exactly what we will be proposing today. A model in order to help the people in need during natural disasters while their governments are not being able to handle the situation properly. Thank you. This brings me to some particular definitions. What do we mean by humanitarian crisis? By humanitarian crisis, we mean natural disasters and famine causing gross lacking of basic necessities in countries. By military intervention, we mean United Nations military forces going into this country, armed. I, as a Prime Minister, will be talking about, first of all, the humanitarian issue and how human rights has to be protected. And secondly, how there's a responsibility to protect, and if violated, how the international community has to step in. The second speaker, first I will be talking about, firstly, genocide of inaction, and secondly, the benefits of military intervention. Mr. Speaker, but before I go into some constructive arguments, let me describe the modern father. We are talking about military intervention by United Nations. United Nations and this model that we're proposing today has to be incorporated into United Nations disaster management program, which already exists. So we are proposing an addition to the United Nations disaster management program, which requires military intervention to occur in situations of humanitarian crisis, Mr. Speaker. But when are we proposing a military intervention? We are proposing it when the aid is being denied by government, when a natural disaster strikes the country, but the aid is being denied by the government, like happened during the Myanmar case. When Myanmar was struck by Hurricane Nargis, what we saw was that Myanmar government, for some period of time, was denying this sort of emergency aid. In this sort of situation, we believe military intervention should occur to help these people in emergency situations. Yes.
Countries around the world have the right to sovereignty, and they can decide when they want to receive the aid.
Yeah, that's exactly what my second argument is about, responsibility to protect versus sovereignty. I'll get into that in my second argument. But before that, back to the model, Mr. Speaker. We are saying that how is this emergency aid going to be distributed? Emergency aid can be in the form of candles, salad, pure water, medicine, Mr. Speaker, clothing, and this sort of food. This sort of emergency aids are what we are talking about. And this sort of aids need to reach the people in a very short notice, no thank you, when natural disaster strikes this country. And we believe, ladies and gentlemen, if this sort of model that we're talking about is incorporated into United Nations disaster management program, it will be much more efficient and help save much more people. But ladies and gentlemen, why are we talking about United Nations? We are talking about United Nations to take this step because it is the most neutral body that can take this step. Because it has had years of experience in going into countries and helping in relief distribution. We're talking about United Nations, thank you, because ladies and gentlemen, it has got an infrastructure which helps in its relief distribution. Because it has, no thank you, it has got a very experienced nature in handling these sort of situations. However, we are adding military intervention to it. Why? Why are we talking about armed military going in as well? We're talking, Mr. Speaker, because when there's resistance coming from a country, when the government doesn't allow aid to go in, and people are dying, there's a necessity for us to save those people in a very short notice. No, thank you. And that's exactly why, to overcome this resistance, there has to be military force going in. when the government is unable to make this aid reach the people in due time because of corruption, because of infrastructural problems, then we have a duty to help this aid reach the people in due time. And that's exactly when this military intervention can take place. But thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, armed military incorporated with the United Nations Disaster Management Program is what we are talking about today, and we believe, and we're proving to you today through our constructive arguments that it will work, and will work in order to save more people than is being saved today. Mr. Speaker, now this brings me to my first argument about first idea about human rights. Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that every single person in this world has got some basic necessities: food, clothing, shelter, education. We all know about this. When a natural disaster strikes, people are being deprived from 4 basic necessities: food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, Mr. Speaker. Every single civilization is built on Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you want to move towards civilization, you have to recognize human rights, have to have some commitment in order to save human rights, Mr. Speaker. When in Myanmar we saw 2.5 million people displaced because of the lateness that occurred while emergency aid reached them, where we saw 1.3 million people in desperate need for food and pure water, we saw gross human rights being, gross violation of human rights, of basic necessities. And that's exactly why there was a need for this emergency aid to reach these people much more quickly. Yes.
Well, there may be a need for food and water, but there's no need for military intervention. They can just receive the food and water.
Yeah. The thing is, this food and water could not reach these people in Myanmar because the government was denying it. Because the government was denying it, to overcome this denial, and for this food and water to reach these people, we had to go through military intervention. Mr. Speaker, secondly, the point about responsibility to protect has also must be taken into consideration. Every single government, when it is elected by the people, has a responsibility towards the people to help it, and to give it aid during natural crisis. But however, during this sort of natural disasters, there's a gross violation of the social contract that the government has to the people. So they're violating a social contract. And when this social contract is being violated by the government, the international community has a right to step in. And that's exactly why, ladies and gentlemen, responsibility to protect, a clause which was incorporated in the United Nations during 2005, endorsed by Kofi Annan, and signed up by the General Assembly. It recognized the fact that the international community has a right to intervene into countries where the government is being unable to react to the situations of humanitarian crisis that we are talking about today. In this sort of situation, sovereignty is overcome by responsibility to protect its violation. And that's what we have shown you today. We've shown you a model which will efficiently and effectively reach the people during natural crisis and natural disasters. We've shown you how responsibility to protect overcomes sovereignty in terms of this humanitarian crisis. We've shown you how human rights is a very great factor, and we have to recognize it. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, keeping all this in mind, we believe military intervention is justified to provide aid during humanitarian crisis. We look out to the course. Thank you very much.
Military can't barge into a foreign country, imposing their rules and shoving their guns in civilian faces. This is why military intervention would create more trouble than there already is. Humanitarian or not, that's just wrong. And either way, they probably have a hidden agenda, and they want to benefit from the crisis, like most countries want. I will first refute some points of the honorable first speaker of the proposition, and then go on to my outline. Well, they said that Myanmar Myanmar denied aid and didn't accept it. But no, they only denied military intervention. They accepted financial aid, they accepted food, and they accepted medicine. Then, of course, they talk about food and medicine. Well, they can just give that to the country. They don't have to barge in with their military. No, thank you. They don't have to barge in with their military, and they think they're over the laws, which they shouldn't be. So now, moving on to my outline, I will be presenting argument 1, challenge to state sovereignty, argument 2, military intervention's counterproductiveness, and lastly, the second speaker of the opposition will present argument 3, weakening international relations. Since Peace of Westphalia in 1648, there has been an agreement to respect sovereignty between the international community. International relations are based on the principles of sovereignty, which means each state is the authority within its borders and they are free to govern without any interference. Humanitarian crises are part of a country's internal affairs. No, thank you. Therefore, country has right to no intervening. For example, after the cyclones in May 2008, like I said, the Myanmar refused any military interventions, but did accept water, medicine, and money. Yes, please.
Myanmar accepting all this financial aid. This did not get to its people due to corruption and due to lack of relief workers. Do you think that it actually solves the humanitarian crisis problem?
Well, it's better than military going into the countries and causing a rebellions and causing the people from the country to start a war versus the military, which causes not only more death but crime. The UN Charter of 1945 runs by the following principle: nothing should authorize intervention in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Military intervention, whatever its purpose, breaks international law by challenging the state's sovereignty and the right to self-determination. In 1989, Panama was facing civil unrest. No, thank you. Because of its dictator Noriega unwilling to step down. The U.S., of course, had to invade Panama in an operation so-called of humanitarian purposes, in an operation where over 300 civilians died, and an action condemned by the international community due to violation of sovereignty. Why now is the UN willing to allow this to happen again, willing to allow people to die? By bringing military men, you're violating the sovereignty of the country's institutions, meaning that they do not have to respond to any authority. Military men are also responsible for causing violence in some circumstances. They enter the country thinking they're above the law, they can do anything they want. It would undermine the power of the police and the power of the government. On the other hand, we have NGOs, which are non-profit organizations, non-governmental organizations, who have to follow the rules if not face expulsion. Nothing. On January 18, 1997, the New York Times reported that 47 Canadian U.S. troops who served in Bosnia were accused of drunkenness, sex, black marketing, and patient abuse at the mental hospital they were supposed to take care of. Now, do you classify this as humanitarian? Do you classify UN troops that were supposed to take care of a hospital abusing them sexually and mentally? I don't think so. In 1996, the UN studied the impact of armed conflict on children. Former First Lady of Mozambique, Graça Machel, documented that in 6 out of 12 country studies of sexual exploitation of children in armed conflict has shown that when peace troops arrive, a sudden increase of child prostitution occurs. NATO troops and UN employees have been directly linked to prostitution and forcing it. How can something so inhumane as child prostitution be characterized as a humanitarian purpose, be characterized as helping the country? Moving on to my second argument, military interventions counterproductiveness. The fact that military interventions imply the presence of guns, which naturally causes rejection and fear between the people and general population. Yes, please.
If these people are being helped by this military intervention, because military intervention is guaranteeing that the food and aid reaches the people, why would the people live with them?
Well, if the military interventions might guarantee that food and water arrive, but maybe the people will fight against them because they didn't agree to this military intervention. They were forced to accept it. Now, Somalis opposed, for example, Somalis opposed the foreign presence. During June and October of 1994, several gun battles in Mogadishu between local gunmen and peacekeepers resulted in over 1,050 deaths. The UN had to withdraw in 1995, having suffered more casualties. Order in Somalia is not yet restored. On August 19, 2003, 24 people were killed and 100 wounded, resulted of a bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad, Iraq. This is another example of one of the many responses that occurred when, in this case, Iraq people did not want the... No, thank you. Iraq did not want the UN's aid and intervention, but yet were forced to receive it against their own will. When a military operation delivers emergency aid, it jeopardizes the aid as it is likely to become a target, making it harder for the aid to arrive. In addition to many unknown variables that cannot be controlled by international countries. The UN World Food Program reported that during recent attack of Bir Masa, Arab militia looted and destroyed 6 World Food Programs and kidnapped the manager for several days. Now, if the military intervention can ensure, it's clear that the military intervention cannot ensure the food and the water's arrival. And it is also clear that the foreign countries opposed to the military intervention, and if forced to receive it, there will create a lot of conflict will be created, and therefore a lot of lives will be lost. In addition to everything mentioned, most of the time, military is not neutral when delivering the aid. So they give more to one side, more to other, which also causes conflict inside of the country. So now, it is clear that military intervention not only increases current problems, but creates more. Because of this, the opposition team doesn't support emergency aid by military intervention. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the interesting thing in today's debate is that Team Zimbabwe never came up to us and denied the fact that due to government negligence, people die within their countries in circumstances of humanitarian crisis. And ladies and gentlemen, that was exactly the stance with which Team Proposition stood up in this debate and said that we need military intervention. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why Sumaiya told you that military intervention is the only way of making sure people, their lives are saved, they get the emergency aid they require in humanitarian crisis. Because governments resist or deny aid from external sources. And that is exactly why, ladies and gentlemen, Team Proposition has put forward this model in this House. Now, to extend Team Proposition's case, I'll be talking to you about how carrying on with negligence, and if the UN does not do anything about it, is genocide of inaction on the UN's part itself. And secondly, I'll be showing you the benefits of the military going in and undertaking this entire endeavor. Before that, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at some points that have been raised by Team Zimbabwe up to now. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at the issue of sovereignty that they're talking about. Secondly, we have to look at the issue of an ulterior motive by the troops that they're talking about. Thirdly, we have to look at conflict, which they've also raised. And fourthly, ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at other bodies such as NGOs, which they have proposed can do the same work. Well, let's look at number one, sovereignty. Ladies and gentlemen, in actually going forward with their case in this House, what Team Zimbabwe have done is that they've told us that sovereignty still stands strong at the end of the day. When sovereignty is the same thing that is killing people within countries, where governments are sovereign, yet they do not help their own people. Where governments, oh thank you ma'am, where governments can deny their own people of the basic necessities and human rights they require at that point of time, ladies and gentlemen. They still stand strong by sovereignty, whereas we see clearly that under those circumstances, people are dying. Ladies and gentlemen, no thank you sir. Ladies and gentlemen, which this entire argument was actually handled by Sumaiya in her first speech, when she said that in 2005, the UN itself recognized the responsibility to protect on the government's part. And if the government fails to do that, sovereignty no longer stands. And ladies and gentlemen, that is an argument the Team Zimbabwe have completely overlooked. And if we look at the second issue, ladies and gentlemen, about an ulterior motive that they've spoken of, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is not the US going into a different country. This is not the UK going into, no thank you ma'am. This is not the UK going into a different country. This is the UN. Ladies and gentlemen, these people are going in under the UN's label. This means they go in, they give aid, they come out. They do not go in as, no thank you. They do not go in as UN troops and stay in as US troops. They go in as the UN, they come out as the UN. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that, well, this entire issue of ultramodem does not stand in a moment now. And ladies and gentlemen, what we also have to look at is the issue of conflicts. Well, they've talked about conflicts, but what we see is, ladies and gentlemen, under humanitarian crisis, well, we never know when a natural disaster strikes. So, for there to be a significant conflict, or for the UN to actually lose or have a risk of losing, ladies and gentlemen, there has to be proper mobilization from the government's part. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that you cannot properly mobilize under circumstances of natural disaster, which you never even expected in the first place. Would you, ma'am?
You've been constantly saying that the UN is not the US. However, most of the troops that the UN provides are US troops.
Yes, ma'am. But does that mean that the US troops under the UN label can still go in and stay on as the US? Ladies and gentlemen, that is the burden of proof on the opposition to show us one circumstance where that has happened. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the last point about NGOs, which they have proposed. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, that NGOs simply cannot do it. If there's government resistance, what makes you so sure that NGOs and normal relief workers can actually go into a country and not get shot dead by trying to deliver emergency aid? No, thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, no, thank you, sir. And that is exactly why we say, ladies and gentlemen, that it is the military who should go in. Now, to look at what I have to extend for team proposition here. First of all, about genocide of inaction, and secondly, about benefits of using the military. Genocide of inaction. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen in Rwanda and Srebrenica, not natural disasters, but at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, what happened was the UN stood by and did nothing to help those regions. What we see at the end of the day is, ladies and gentlemen, 800,000 people died in Rwanda. Why? Because the UN had a responsibility to protect its member state, yet did not fulfill it. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the UN stood by, watched people die. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that is wrong, because the UN has a responsibility to step up here and live up to its entire purpose. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that if the UN stands by, in a moment, sir. We say that if the UN stands by and does not fulfill its responsibility to protect these people under these circumstances, that in itself is genocide on the UN's part. Is it not, sir?
Protect. They're increasing child prostitution and killing lots of people.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, what team opposition is standing here on is very thin ice. They're talking about casualties of war, which are not even significant if you compare to the amount of benefits that they're bringing to the home countries themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, we understand that in every circumstance of war, there will be casualties. But what we also understand is that at the end of the day, the entire purpose of delivering aid in these circumstances will be achieved. And that is exactly, no thank you, that is exactly the point on which team proposition stands. Now, having seen that, ladies and gentlemen, let us look at my second argument about benefits of using the military. What we see here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the entire parameter that was set by Sumaiya was that governments are denying external aid. When she said that governments are denying external aid, it's only relevant that, well, if you want to go in, there has to be an element of force. And for that to happen, ladies and gentlemen, we say, who else other than the military? And for that to happen, ladies and gentlemen, we say, who else than a global, a military consisting of all global elements, and hence, why not the UN? No, thank you, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, on these grounds, we say the military is, of course, number one, they have better equipment. Secondly, they have better training. Ladies and gentlemen, third of all, they have better authority. No, thank you, sir. Well, let's look at training. Well, a military body is trained for anything, to do anything, anytime. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why we say that it is only the military who can undertake such an endeavor at time of humanitarian crisis. No, thank you, ma'am. In an area that has been struck by natural disaster. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, it is the same military that has the equipment, has the transport, has the necessity or infrastructure to actually go forward and undertake this, because what we see is, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, sir, is under a situation of a natural disaster. It is not quite easy for you to go in. But what we see, ladies and gentlemen, if you need tanks, NGOs and other relief programs don't have tanks. If you need other such equipment, ladies and gentlemen, nobody is as better equipped as the military. And that is why we stand by this proposition. And what we also have to look at, ladies and gentlemen, is the issue of authority. Well, this is just true. A person in a uniform is much better side of authority than a normal relief worker. Ladies and gentlemen, a person in uniform holding a gun is a much better image of authority than a normal relief program. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that in itself holds back conflict. That in itself holds back rebellion, because these people mean business and these people are in there to deliver the aid that they promised. That is why we say, ladies and gentlemen, there will be better cooperation with these UN military workers at the end of the day. So to see what team proposition has actually shown you, ladies and gentlemen, we've told you that in natural disasters where there is significant government resistance to providing emergency aid, and where the government is negligent and also incapable, and at the end of the day, they're still denying the fact that others can help them. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that we must go in with an element of force and deliver the aid and save the lives of these people, such as those in Myanmar and such as those in Myanmar and in North Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see at the end of the day is that if we want to save these lives, we have to deliver the aid if we want to deliver the aid, we need an element of force. And for that force to be neutral, for that force to actually work out and not suffer long-term consequences, ladies and gentlemen, that force has to be the UN. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, we beg to carry the motion. Thank you.
A few weeks ago, in August, Russia invaded its neighbor country, Georgia, supposedly to defend the people from attacks they were suffering from the government, which they call for the need of humanitarian aid. However, is this the real reason behind the invasion? Not at all. What they're looking for is to annex South Ossetia to its own country, and they have refused in several occasions to withdrawing the troops from Georgia. Now, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by refuting what the proposition team has said. First of all, I'd like to clarify that they haven't specified why the military intervention is better than any other source for providing humanitarian aid. How is it better? By having guns and killing people? Not at all. What we are proposing, on the other hand, are NGOs which can actually provide the humanitarian aid that people need in a peaceful manner. We also propose embargoes which will stop any arms from going in anymore. They have constantly been saying that the military intervention is good because it is the UN troops which will be the ones going into the country which needs the aid. However, how can the UN be the most neutral organization? It may be the most neutral organization, but it is not very neutral. Why? Because who leads the UN? The USA, of course. And they are the ones who send the most troops into the country. No, thank you. Now, they're also mentioning that they strongly defend human rights, and we do also defend human rights. However, how come they then support the military intervention if what the troops do is kill people, and as my first speaker has clearly specified, they have black market, sex, and child prostitution and everything. Now, the example they're constantly using as well is Myanmar. They say that Myanmar refused all aid. However, the government, no thank you, however, the government did accept the aid after a few days, and they didn't, no thank you, no military intervention was needed because, no thank you, because the government realized it needed to accept the aid, and it didn't want the military in the military form, but instead they wanted just food, water, medicines. Now, they also mentioned that when there's a violation of the social contract, the international community has the right to get into the country and help. However, this can be solved with diplomacy, and military intervention is not needed. As I have already stated, we can use NGOs and embargoes. Yes, please.
Ma'am, since you're talking about diplomacy, it is diplomacy in itself that delayed the aid process in Myanmar and killed hundreds of thousands of people. How do you justify that?
Well, diplomacy, every country, as we have already said, have the right to sovereignty. And diplomacy is the only way to solve things without causing further trouble in the countries. Even though it may take the government a few days to realize what is to be done, they eventually do it because they look for the best of its people and they know that military intervention is not. Now, they were also talking about the casualties that are caused by war and not by the humanitarian crisis which they have been describing. However, by forcing the military into a country, they are creating a war. The UN is creating a war, and therefore the casualties that we have already mentioned. Furthermore, they say that the military are the right people to do it, because they have the equipment, the right equipment, and the right training. However, what are the military trained to do? They're trained to kill. And what is their equipment? Their equipment is guns and tanks. So what are you proposing? That they go in with this equipment, supposedly the right one, in order to kill? No, thank you. We don't want violence. They also said that because the military are the ones who have the guns, they are the ones who provide a better image. But a better image of what? A better image of war? The aid has to be provided in another way, as my first speaker has already said. Now, I'd like to move on to our third argument, which is the weakening international relations. First of all, by accepting the military interventions, the country is being seen by the international community as weaker, Why? Because supposedly the intervention comes when the country cannot solve its own issues. If a country cannot solve its own internal affairs, then every other country will look down towards it, and bridges will be created in what should be a brotherhood. Now, moving on to my second reason, which is that military interventions create dependency. The country does not learn how to handle its own issues because they're supposedly, as the proposition would say, saved by the military intervention. However, the only thing that military intervention is that it creates more problems. The countries suffer a downturn after the intervention because people rely on the aid they receive, and once the intervention goes away, the situation will go back to how it was before and nothing will be solved. No, thank you. Now, an example is the US intervening in Haiti. It has done this 4 times, and yet we see that Haiti has not managed to overcome its problems. For example, in 2006, Haiti was ranked as the most corrupt nation out of 163. Obviously, the 4 military interventions didn't cause any good at all. Now, our third reason for this argument is that, no, thank you, the military intervention risks further abuses to developing countries because the military interventions come with a political or an economic purpose, let's say a hidden agenda, as the example I gave in my introduction on Russia and Georgia. For example, in 1999, the NATO declared that they had a goal of defending human rights in Kosovo and Yugoslavia. However, when the time to negotiate came, they set 3 main objectives, which were to dismantle Yugoslavia's competing socialist economic system, to gain control of valuable mineral resources, and to command the site of a future energy distribution network. Obviously, the military intervention was not to solve the humanitarian crisis, but to achieve the purposes which were hidden behind this. Now, yes, please.
Ma'am, could we please have at least one circumstance where the UN has intervened and the UN has done something in the long, to harm it in the long term?
You have given examples of the UN, and the perfect example is Myanmar. It was solved without the UN having to send military. The problem was solved by the government recognizing what it had to do, and the military intervention could be avoided. So, in conclusion, what we're saying is that because of all these reasons that we've mentioned, and because the only thing that military interventions do is bring further problems to a country which is already in trouble, this House does not support military intervention to deliver emergency aid. Thank you.
What we debate in this House today is this House supports military intervention to provide emergency aid during humanitarian crisis. I, as the third speaker of the opposition, will be providing first the rebuttals to the second opposition speaker and her constructive arguments. I'll be moving on to a summary of the proposition case and how well the opposition has rebutted us or not at all. And thirdly, I'll be identifying 3 clashes in this House. The first clash being on the status that needs to be clarified because it has brought about irrelevant examples. And secondly, about the clash of UN. Is it actually the proper authority and is it actually capable? And thirdly, military. In military, we ask 2 questions. Is it actually better than NGOs? And number 2, will they create a war? Now moving on to the rebuttals to the constructive provided by the second opposition speaker. Number 1, she asked, how is military intervention better than NGOs? I'll be answering in one of my clashes, as I mentioned. Secondly, she talked about diplomacy. When you talk about diplomacy, sir, you have to look at the time factor. Diplomacy can go on for ages. And when there is a humanitarian crisis that needs to be answered right there, right then, because people are dying with every second, ladies and gentlemen.
Point of information.
I'll not take that. Therefore, when this time factor comes into question, diplomacy is not an alternative. The second thing that she talked about is weakening international relations, ladies and gentlemen. If we are talking about weakening international relations, we have to see why the humanitarian crisis occurred in the first place. Not like Russia, not like Kosovo. They were not political conflicts. They were not war. They were not calls for independence, ladies and gentlemen. They were simply due to natural disasters, ladies and gentlemen. Because this is the cause, we do not believe there will be any weakening international relations, nor, as she suggested, there will be any dependency on military intervention, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I'll take that.
Well, those natural disasters are used as an excuse to take abuse of the crisis.
Thank you, sir.
This is where I'll clarify our status in the first clash. Before that, I'll be moving on to the summary of the proposition speech. What the proposition has given me in the House today, number one, is the cases in countries such as Myanmar and in North Korea. They have brought out the example of Myanmar, which is actually finally accepted aid. Before it accepted aid, 100,000 people have died or more. Is this what we're going to talk about? They spent while people died? No, sir. No, ma'am. We're talking about instant action. And if they are talking about North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be mentioning it further in my speech. Secondly, we also talked about... Yes, I'll take that.
You talk of the UN providing aid immediately. Where do the funds for the UN come from? I mean, this is a multinational organization. Do the funds just appear out of nowhere? I mean, how are you going to organize all of that?
Thank you, sir, for one technical POI. If you're talking about UN funds, we have to see how we have stood our model in the UN Disaster Relief Management Program, and that always has funds. Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, the first argument that we presented in this House today is human rights. When we talk about universal human rights, no reason can stand above, because we are human and it has to be accepted. And from the opposition, there was no rebuttal, because it is not possible. Human rights is sovereignty. Secondly, we talked about responsibility to protect versus national sovereignty. They have talked about sovereignty of nations to take care of themselves. We'd say, on the other hand, if governments are unable to take care of their own people, ladies and gentlemen, then they have no right to sovereignty. Whose sovereignty are we talking about? The government sovereignty or the people's sovereignty? We advocate for people's lives rather than any sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, because people's rights are their sovereignty. We are not going to protect sovereignty of a government who is unable to take care of their people and unable to carry out the responsibility it has to protect its people. I'll not take that. The second argument we presented, third argument that we presented in this House today was genocide of inaction, ladies and gentlemen. Why the UN actually has a right to do so, because it is a global forum, and in its charter it has mentioned that it will do anything in its own capabilities to uphold human rights above all clauses, even national sovereignty, and that even cannot be rebutted. Next, we move on to the benefits of military. We have talked about their resources, we have talked about their benefits, we have talked about how they can help the people better than any other institution. After providing a summary, I move on to my first clash about clearing the status. We have talked about natural disasters, not wars, ladies and gentlemen. That is where all the examples of the war crimes, the sexual abuse crimes, ladies and gentlemen, you have to compare natural disaster humanitarian crisis to a war humanitarian crisis. In a war, two countries are trying to overcome each other. One is trying to win over the other. One is trying to show that I am stronger. But in a humanitarian crisis that can result from natural disaster, there is no clash between two parties. No one saying that, yes, this is my piece of land. Nobody is saying that. One party is asking for help, another providing it. Military intervention provides beds. That is why we support military intervention. I'll not take that. The second thing that needs to be clarified in the House, ladies and gentlemen, is I remind you that the natural disasters do not have any political causes behind them. Therefore, the UN definitely not being a US puppet, because UN is a global forum. This is total speculation and a very unacceptable assumption on the opposition part that the US is run by the UN. US may be a great donor, but the decisions at the end of the day do go through the General Assembly and the Security Council, where every other country has its distributed says and rights and votes, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, UN is the most neutral, as the second opposition did agree. Another thing that we need to clarify in the House, ladies and gentlemen, is Russia invading Georgia is not any concern in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, because we're not talking about nations and who should own one state over the other. We are talking about people dying, maybe due to hurricanes, maybe due to cyclones, ladies and gentlemen. Especially in the last 30 years, there has been a 31% increase in the number of annual strong cyclones in the House, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, what have I clarified in this House? The examples provided by the opposition regarding war, regarding sexual abuse, regarding soldiers and how abusive and exploitive they are do not stand because of the very purpose and the very initiation of the humanitarian crisis due to natural disaster and not any political cause or cause for independence, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to my second clash. Why the UN, ladies and gentlemen? If we're talking about UN, we talk about neutrality, we talk about experience, and we talk about the better aid infrastructure. But before that, if The opposition can provide us with examples with USA intervening in Panama and USA intervening in Haiti. We say that the UN intervened in Cambodia and was welcomed with open arms. So when NATO talk about exploitation, they talk about NATO exploitation of human rights, we talk about how NATO give independence to Kosovo, ladies and gentlemen. There is goods and bads in all scenarios, but the only difference being is the cause behind the humanitarian crisis, ladies and gentlemen. And this is not war crimes that we are talking about. Now we see military. Is it better than NGOs? Yes, number one, because of resources. We talk of resources. Now my example of North Korea, as I mentioned before, comes into action. North Korea has great mountainous regions, due to which food cannot be provided to them due to famine. That is where our tanks come in, and our military helicopters come in, ladies and gentlemen. In terrain, mountains in North Korea can only be tackled best by the military, because they know how to penetrate within a region and a territory, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we say they have the resources. We say they have the protection because they have the arms. We say that they are the only ones who can overcome resistance, totally ignored by the opposition. That we are talking about resistance from the government to provide aids to its people, ladies and gentlemen. And who can overcome resistance? Force. Who will provide the force? Military intervention. Now the second question about military being creating war or not. It will definitely not create a war, because we said nobody is trying to win over anybody. Secondly, they have civilian support because the civilians want aid. And thirdly, because the resisting country will not be able to mobilize its army or its tanks in time, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we have established that the arguments by the proposition standing in the House, be it genocide of inaction, be it responsibility to protect versus sovereignty, be it human rights, or be it the benefits of the military. We have told you how the status quo provided by the proposition is the best, and we have told you how the UN is the best at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, the proposition takes a debate hike.
In my case division, I'm going to start by rebutting their main points. I will then reiterate and add some clarity to our main points, and after that I will summate. To begin with, their main points, we hear talking of the UN supplying troops and the UN coming with an international organization and these troops coming in and delivering aid. And they say they're going to have a natural disaster fund which will always be there. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition has not clearly stated why countries would have it in their best interest to create a natural disaster fund and have troops that will always be there to supply these finances and these funds to this cause. Ladies and gentlemen, we can identify that the UN can disagree about whether or not to send troops into a country to deliver humanitarian aid. We've seen this when the US wanted to deliver aid to Iraq. Yes, it's not the UN, but the US took it to the UN and the UN condemned it, and Germany and France actually declared that they did not, no sir, no ma'am, they did not want the US to deliver this aid, but the US ignored it anyway. And these type of divisions can occur inside of the UN because it's such a large body of many different states. And this is why the UN is not exactly the most, it's not right for them to use military aid to deliver this. Second of all, ladies and gentlemen, their second speaker identified a threat to NGOs, saying that if the aid is being denied, NGOs can easily be shot down. So what happens if the military gets shot at? Yes, this is not a war, but if the military gets shot at, that is definitely going to result in a war. I don't see how you can debate that. Yes, ma'am.
Are the dying civilians going to shoot the military?
No, but if the military are going to get shot at, is that not going to result in a war? We can look at civilians causing uproar in the streets where the military come in because people walking around with guns intimidate civilians. This is why Myanmar did not accept military intervention to begin with, because they were not sure about the initial intentions of the US Army and other military aid that came into Myanmar, and they were worried about their civilians. That's why they first pursued diplomacy, and only after diplomacy did they agree to allow. No, I will not take it. Did they agree they agreed for this aid to be delivered? Of course, you're going to tell me that diplomacy causes delay, which causes waste of life. But, ladies and gentlemen, if we look at this diplomacy, we look at peaceful measures of supplying this aid. I mean, if you're hungry, you're being deprived of medicine and food, and you have people coming in with tanks. That is not exactly the most peaceful measure of delivering this aid. If we can establish an organization which has a peaceful policy, so that in any event of natural disaster, peaceful means can be used to deliver this aid. There will be no need for military intervention, which will be intimidating to the public, and will cause unsettlement. How will it cause unsettlement, you may ask?
Yes,
ma'am.
Which is more important, the method of delivery or that the delivered goods save lives?
Well, if the method of delivery can cause disruption in a country, which is what my first two speakers have stated, then of course the method of delivery is important. I mean, if you come inside and you start gunning people, coming in guns blazing, and you're saying you're delivering in aid, and other people come in with peace flags and deliver this aid peacefully and come in helping, rather than coming in armies and boots and uniforms, then obviously the method of delivery is going to be more important. I mean, if you're saving lives at the end of the day, you need to have a firm method of delivery, which does not necessarily entail to military intervention. Military intervention is not the only way to deliver aid during humanitarian crisis, ladies and gentlemen, and that is what the opposition here has come to say. We will now talk about how they have spoken about how the sovereignty of the country is more important. No matter. The sovereignty of the country is more important than the lives. Yes, this is true. But if the sovereignty of the country is disrespected to the point of the levels of such as Iraq, such as Afghanistan, we can see what is going on there, where now there is absolutely no structure in the country, the economies are falling, and troops have come there for 10 years. Another reason, ladies and gentlemen, while their policy falls flat on its face, is because they have not stated how long the aid will be there for, how the aid is going to come in and deliver this, how the military is going to deliver this aid, and when they will get out. They said the UN is going to send troops to come in and get out. How is that just going to magically happen? They have not made a clear statement of how this is going to be done, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we have seen that military intervention causes high crime rates and causes things like rape, sexual harassment, and a bunch of other taboos that cannot be accepted in these types of situations. And they have said that no, this is only when American soldiers come in. But no, ladies and gentlemen, this is the army in general, because we can see that the army are people that are trained to fight. They're not the most peaceful people in the world. So if they're used to deliver aid in humanitarian crisis, it is definitely going to result in some sort of criminal activity. Be it black marketing, be it rape, be it child molestation, be it prostitution. Because these are people who are trained to fight, and mentally their outlook on life is that of a warrior, and that is what their duty is. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to pursue more peaceful means of delivering aid into humanitarian crises. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll move on to bringing some clarity and reiterating our main points. Our main arguments are that, ladies and gentlemen, we need to use diplomacy. Myanmar accepted aid, which is the example that they gave, yes?
So Myanmar accepted aid after 1 week of being offered that 100,000 people died because of it. Can you accept it?
We cannot accept that, of course not. Who would accept 100,000 people dying? But what we can accept is that the army came in and they were not, the aid was delivered and they were not shot at, and there was no rebellion, and thus this did not lead to more problems. How did this not lead to more problems? Because there was diplomacy used, and because military intervention is not the only method that can be used to deliver humanitarian aid. Now, yes. So we talk of humanitarian crises, and we talk of how bringing the army into a country can cause more problems than it can solve. Of course, the army comes in and delivers aid, but can you simply ignore the rape and the child molestation and the abuse that the civilians suffer? Yes, I'll take you, sir.
So, sir, can you ignore diplomacy being delayed to the effect of killing thousands of people?
Well, if diplomacy is used in the right way, it will not kill thousands of people. However, I don't believe that the military there will ever be a time when military intervention is used and corruption does not occur, because the military is a corrupt force in any state and in any organization. And this is because of the way that they are trained in the battlefields, and they are trained to be killing machines, and this is why I do not see how it is feasible for them to deliver aid. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll begin to summarize our main points. Our main points are that military intervention to deliver human aid will challenge the state's sovereignty. This can lead to the state collapsing, such as we have seen in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We've seen that it can lead to counterproduction. This is where states start to rely on the aid, as the proposition has not specified how long the military will be there for, and they could be there for ages, and as a result there will be more wars and more people will be dying. And third of all, the military intervention can weaken international relations. This can be seen through international organizations such as the UN, which are essential to peacekeeping, disagreeing over what to do, and this can lead to wars. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
And the proposition team proposes UN troops. Ladies and gentlemen, there are three main clashes which we have found in this debate, and they are the NGOs and embargoes versus the UN troops, the sovereignty and human rights versus the military intervention, and war versus natural disasters. Now, our first clash is NGOs and embargoes versus the UN troops. As we have been saying throughout the debate, we do not support UN troops because what they lead to is more problems. Instead, we mention that the NGOs and embargoes are more efficient because they avoid any more trouble. Now, the proposition has been constantly saying that the UN troops are better because they have the right training and the right equipment. However, what we say is that they are trained to kill and their equipment are guns and tanks. So, how can the UN troops be better if what they are going to do is use their supposedly right equipment to do their right training and therefore cause more problems in the country? Now, our second clash is sovereignty and human rights versus forced military intervention. We strongly support sovereignty because it helps the country to solve its own internal affairs and because it is the right of every country in the world to rule themselves by sovereignty. However, the proposition has kept on saying that if the aid is not accepted, then forced military intervention has to go into the country. However, this would be definitely violating the right to sovereignty, and it would be creating more problems to a country which is already in trouble. Now, in this clash, there's also the point of human rights. We cannot accept that the proposition claims that they support human rights when what they are proposing is military intervention that will only cause, as I have already said, further problems in the country. As we've said, it is as if it was a war being created by the UN by forcing the troops into the country. And so the casualties will result from it and human rights will be violated. We gave the examples of child prostitution, sex, black marketing, and violation of human rights in hospitals that the military were supposed to look after. And finally, our third clash was war versus natural disasters. The proposition team defined that the humanitarian crisis was the case of famines and the case of natural disasters. However, we haven't heard one single example of famine and why the military intervention is needed to solve the famine. What we have been saying is that by forcing the troops into a country, by forcing military intervention into a country, a war is being created, and therefore casualties result from it. Now, in their plan, they also proposed a new institution in the UN, which would be in charge of delivering emergency aid in cases of humanitarian crisis. However, how will this institution be funded? And how can you suddenly create an institution when the aid is needed right away? Furthermore, we've only heard the benefits, and we haven't heard the damages that the military intervention caused. We have accepted that the UN may be the most neutral institution in the world. However, it is not neutral at all because, as we have said, it is the countries who fund the most and the countries who provide the most troops who have the greatest influence in the end. This is why we believe that military intervention should not be used to deliver emergency aid in humanitarian crises.
At the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves three simple questions. First of all, Mr. Speaker, what's the best, or why is the United Nations taking this step? Secondly, what's the best way to help the people who are being hurt by natural disaster, are not being helped by the government? And thirdly, what is more important, sovereignty of state or saving people? Ladies and gentlemen, before going into this, we have to understand three things. Both sides agree that human rights are being violated and we need to do something about it. Both sides agree, ladies and gentlemen, humanitarian crises are disastrous situations and people need to be saved by this, ladies and gentlemen. Both sides agree that actions must be taken to save these people. However, the difference between both sides, proposition or the opposition, is to how to help these people. And that's exactly where this debate ended into. Why is the United Nations, first of all, helping these people? And ladies and gentlemen, some questions appeared very lately into this debate about where the United Nations gets these funds. Funds are already there. United Nations disaster management programs already exist. The question about why would countries want to help these affected countries, where does the funds come from, are totally irrelevant in the context of the debate. The question of the division in opinion, there might be divisions in opinion. USA might not want to join in. USA might not want to join in and help this affected country. China might want to join in and help this affected country. This division of opinion, ladies and gentlemen, has no context of operating because of the fact that United Nations is the most efficient organization in helping these people. Even they agree to us, Mr. Speaker. They can take decisions very fast, and ladies and gentlemen, they can take this decision fast because the P5 countries, permanent 5 countries, are deciding on it, ladies and gentlemen. And that's exactly where the effectiveness comes in. Decisions can be taken very fast, and emergency aid can reach these people very fast. How long do the aids stay in this affected area? That again came up very late into this debate. It's pretty simple. As long as it is needed, as long as the humanitarian crisis persists, as long as the people are suffering, as long as gross violation of basic necessities occur, you have to stay in there to ensure that the aid is reaching the people. So, ladies and gentlemen, United Nations has got a very valid reason to go and take steps about this natural disaster affected countries. And United Nations is the most efficient organization to handle the situation. Second question, what's the best way to help these people? Understand, Mr. Speaker, they gave us two alternatives. First of all, NGOs. Secondly, diplomacy. About NGOs, understand, Mr. Speaker, NGOs need assistance while delivering this aid. NGOs cannot force itself into countries where it is being denied. That's exactly where military intervention comes in. Military protects these NGOs, assists these NGOs in distributing these aids, ladies and gentlemen. About the point of diplomacy, they didn't really tell us how countries will actually talk it out. The only point of diplomacy that they could bring about was the point of embargoes. Understand, embargoes means stopping trading with a country. If an affected country is there, natural disaster affected country, if you stop trading with it, you're pushing these people further into debt. How are you helping these people? So ladies and gentlemen, NGOs need military intervention backup, and secondly, diplomacy in the form of embargoes do not work, actually harms the people. What did we say? We said that the best way to help these people is through military intervention. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because it is the most efficient form of making these people have this aid. Military intervention has got an infrastructure. Military intervention has got, ladies and gentlemen, authority, has got training, has got equipment to deal with the situations. They have got, ladies and gentlemen, helicopters and tanks to deal with harsh terrains. They've got, ladies and gentlemen, trained people to hand out these aids to the people who are suffering. And that's exactly why military intervention really works, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, when it comes to sovereignty versus responsibility to protect, ladies and gentlemen, sovereignty is something which is overlapped by the people's lives, and you have to save people. At the end of the day, United Nations is the best way to help these people, and military intervention is the best way to help these people, and sovereignty is overlapped. We're practical.